outside the lines. The refrain's in your bulletin. We do the refrain. I do a verse. You do the refrain with me. I do another verse. We do the refrain. We've done this for a while, so by now you should know the refrain. We're going to go for it, okay? Here we go.
Our first reading this morning is probably familiar to you. It's from the Gospel of John, chapter 20, and it's the first, according to the Gospel of John, it is the first resurrection appearance. Early on the first day of the week, that was Easter, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her.
This is a poem, Constructive Theologian, by the Reverend Charles Harper. Aloft in thin air of thought and mystery, he walks a high wire strung between pinnacles of ancient orthodoxy and postmodern intuition. His balancing rod, slender wings of integration, dips deftly up and down with each step and pause on the wire, swaying in the swift wind of God's breathing.
Roberta has just begun an ambitious sermon series in which she promises to address such controversial issues as conflicts in the early church, heresies, and church history and theology that pastors learn in seminary and then never share with their congregations. That's almost a direct quote. She began the series and then she promptly left town. Actually, we talked, and I agreed to preach on some of the issues raised in Dan Brown's popular book and movie, The Da Vinci Code. Then I reread the book and remembered how many issues it raises. In the interest of everything else you might want to do today, I'm just going to hit some of the highlights. They may not be your favorite highlights, but they're some of mine. And then I'll pass some other issues back to Roberta, and I think that's fair, don't you? How many of you have read the Da Vinci Code? A pretty good percentage. How many have seen the movie? Both. Well, first, let me be clear that the book is fiction. Some people are threatened by the book. A lot of people. When I first read the book, I was preaching in Massachusetts, and there were a lot more people in Massachusetts threatened by the book, for obvious reasons, I think. I'm not threatened by the book. In fact, I'm fascinated by it. I see it as both an exciting, page-turning mystery and a starting point for some great questioning about both church history and personal faith. The Da Vinci Code has made many people think about Jesus, about the church, ancient and modern. And if a popular book makes people think, makes them question their faith tradition, makes them wonder about church history, I say wonderful. Especially if they're willing to dig a little to figure out what is really factual about our church history. And believe me, having just spent a week delving into our church history that I have once learned and thought I still knew, it takes digging. So, first, a quick plot summary. In between hair-raising action scenes, two men of apparently impeccable credentials reveal to a young French woman named Sophie a radical retelling of some of the elements of the Christian story. They reveal, for example, that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene and became a father. They tell us that the early Christians all knew that Jesus was only human until the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century imposed the idea of Jesus' divinity on the church for political reasons. And that throughout history, the church conspired to hide these secrets from the world, even conspiring to portray Mary Magdalene as a whore to discredit her. The proof, they tell Sophie, has been kept safe through the centuries by a secret society. Now, a crisis envelops Sophie and the two men when an extremist Catholic group really goes over the edge and commits murder in order to find the secret proof so that it can never be revealed. And underneath and through the book, there is this not so subtle assumption, not assertion, but it's under the surface, it's an assumption, that the secret must be kept a secret, because if Christians discovered the truth, their faith would be destroyed. Now that truth that they fear disclosing seems to me to include both the portrayal of Jesus as a sexual man and the nature of the church's conspiracy. It's quite a book. Dan Brown is a very clever writer. He sprinkles enough real history throughout the novel to make it seem totally factual, even to people who've known quite a bit about the church history. After an initial gasp of shock, the character Sophie settles in and swallows the whole story. And so, apparently, do many readers. Oh, not the chases and the escapes and the murders and the plot reversals, but all those parts about Jesus and Mary Magdalene and the church, ancient and modern, secrets and conspiracy and all the rest. People who haven't ever wanted to know anything about the early church, how Christian theology developed, and who wrote the creeds, and when, and why, many of those same people swallowed this revisionist version wholesale. And I find that both fascinating and a bit disturbing. Now, it's complicated, and I don't have time today to explore the entire line between fact and fiction that winds all over the place throughout this novel. I just want to lift up a few questions and a little factual church history to help us think about them. First, there's that question of the Emperor Constantine imposing Jesus' divinity on the church. Dan Brown paints a very simple picture. He says all the early Christians agreed that Jesus was only human, until the Emperor Constantine imposed the idea of Jesus' divinity on the entire church at the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Actually, nothing in the early development of Christianity was anything near that simple. It still isn't. In recent times, actually, since the 18th century, there's been a great deal of emphasis on discovering the historical Jesus, meaning who Jesus was as a man. Now, the details are way beyond the scope of this sermon, and I thank Dan Brown for that. Suffice it to say, there is no agreement, even among scholars who have read not only what the church has had to say, but all the documents that have ever been found about Jesus. There is no agreement. Recent portraits of the historical Jesus include an apocalyptic prophet, a charismatic leader, a cynic philosopher, the Jewish Messiah, and prophet of social change. And I'm sure there are more. That's just some of them that popped into mind. Perhaps Roberta will address some more of the historical Jesus material someday. But you know what? None of that really helps us to understand what the people who knew Jesus thought, what and who they thought he was during his lifetime. And after Jesus' death and resurrection, his followers experienced him in ways that couldn't easily be explained. They just couldn't fit him into their usual conceptual boxes. And so it seems clear to me that that is why, beginning at the very beginning with those very first experiences of his presence, and those very first stories about encounters that people were having with him, his followers began trying to understand and find words to express the totality of who he was, particularly his relationship with the God he called Father. I believe that the authors of the Gospels that are in the Bible, and many other books that were written at the same time, were much more theologians than just reporters of fact. This seems particularly true in the Gospel of John, which includes the I am sayings. You know, all those sayings of Jesus saying, I am the resurrection of the life and the life. I am. There are a whole lot of them you could probably name. And also that beautiful prologue of the Gospel of John, which identifies Jesus as the eternal Word of God from the very beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The portrayal of Jesus in John's Gospel seems much more divine than the portrayals in the other Gospels. The idea that Jesus was divine seems to me to have developed over time until by the 4th century, the time of that Council of Nicaea, most of the bishops and other church leaders were fully convinced of his divinity. And those bishops were in a position to mandate what every single Christian, East and West Church, must believe about Jesus, on threat of excommunication or, in some instances, even death. Now, this power was dramatically increased when the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. And there were violent disagreements among the bishops, so violent that they threatened the peace of the empire. So when Constantine convened the First Council of Nicaea in 325, inviting at least all of the church's bishops from East and West, his motives were at least largely political. As I understand the history, he wanted to bring those warring Christian leaders together, not to impose a new theology that he had invented on all of the bishops, but to get them to reach some kind of agreement that would let them live in peace and not be fighting all the time. So he gathered as many as he could of the bishops in Nicaea. And the hottest issue at that council, the one that they had to resolve, because it was already the most fiercely contested issue among the bishops, was in fact the divinity of Jesus. Now, it's really complicated. There's a reason why pastors don't preach on this very often. It's really complicated. But in overly simple terms, on one side were the Arians, who argued that Jesus was a man, a very good and important man, so good that he became God's son, but not God, and particularly that his beginning was not the same as God's beginning. Now, the other side, which was the more powerful faction, focused primarily on the divinity of Christ, arguing that he was of the same substance as God the Father, and that he had been with the Father forever. Now, Arius had already been excommunicated by the time of this council for his views about Jesus being only human. But he did have supporters among the bishops. And the bishops spent fully half of their more than a month-long council arguing about this issue called the Arian controversy. And ultimately, the council agreed on one creed, the Nicene Creed. How many of you have heard of the Nicene Creed? Many of us grew up saying it in church. It is actually used in many, many churches today in many different, slightly different forms. But it includes these words about Jesus. We believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. Sound familiar? Yeah, that brings back my childhood. So Arius lost. The council rejected the idea that Jesus was only human or that he had come into existence sometime after God the Father. Constantine added one word. It's an important word to the creed. The word, and I don't speak Greek very well, so it's homoousios. And it means that Jesus Christ was of one substance with God the Father. So, did Constantine impose the idea of the divinity of Jesus on a church that believed otherwise until 325? as Dan Brown suggests? I don't think so. The church had been working on that for 300 years. But the work of that council formalized a creed that clearly required all Christians to believe that Jesus was divine and eternal. And that has been a core belief in Orthodox Christianity. And by Orthodox, I mean core. Like in seminary, we had to learn what's the Orthodox position. What's the main position of Christianity through the years? And then we could diverge from that, but we had to start with that. And that's what was decided there. The Nicene Creed does recognize that Jesus became incarnate and was made man. And later councils, there were a whole bunch of councils, and later councils would expressly declare that Jesus was fully human and fully divine. Does that sound familiar? That's also a core belief. But it does seem that the First Council of Nicaea marks a radical shift of the church's teaching from the man Jesus to the divine Christ. It wasn't new, but it was a big shift in that direction. Of course, not everybody has believed that through the centuries. There have been lots of groups of people of various types that have gone off in other directions. And you know what, folks? The thoughts of the Arians are alive and well in the church today. There are probably some sitting right here. We're not going to count. And how does the UCC look at the Nicene Creed and other creeds? Well, this is important to us, I think. The UCC does not use any of the ancient creeds as a test for membership or for faithfulness. The preamble to the UCC Constitution says, and I quote, "The United Church of Christ claims as its own the faith of the historic church, expressed in the ancient creeds and reclaimed in the basic insights of the Protestant reformers. It affirms the responsibility of the church in each generation to make this faith its own in reality of worship, in honesty of thought and expression, and in purity of heart before God." Now, there's a topic for a whole sermon series, but we're not going to go there. Anyway, this is important, unlike many churches, the UCC does not brand people as heretics if they don't believe every word of the Nicene or any other creed. And that makes me, and perhaps you, rest a little easier. The creeds are considered, this is the wording of the UCC, testimonies, not tests. But back to the book. We don't have to do any more history. Back to the book. Dan Brown posits that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene and they had a child. He goes on to say that the church was so threatened by this idea that they conspired to demonize Mary Magdalene, deliberately and wrongly accusing her of being a whore. Well, again, there's a bit of truth to that, but it's overstated. The idea that Mary Magdalene was a whore originated in a sermon by Pope Gregory in the late 6th century, when he incorrectly identified Mary with another woman who was a prostitute, another woman in the Gospels. His error was later corrected. Can you imagine a Pope's comment later being corrected because it was wrong? It was later corrected, although that identification still continues in some documents. In fact, notes of some study Bibles, not the ones we use mostly, but some of them still have that. But even when Gregory made that error, even in his sermon, he wasn't condemning Mary Magdalene as a whore. He was recognizing her redemption, pointing out how far she had come from where she had been, the importance of her turning away from her sin, not criticizing her for it. And significantly, Both the Eastern and Western churches recognize Mary Magdalene as a saint and as the first person to see the risen Christ. And that comes from the passage we read this morning. Did they deliberately demonize her? Well, what do you think? Now, does that mean that the church through the centuries has treated women with the respect that we, and maybe Jesus, would have wanted? For example, as priests or as spouses of priests? Well, that's beyond the scope of this sermon too, but I obviously like where the United Church of Christ comes out on its treatment of women, which has not been the universal position of the church. So finally, how about that most controversial Da Vinci Code assertion that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married? The underlying assumption of the book is that if this were known, it would shake our faith to the core. But is there any truth to this statement? We could argue until we were blue in the face about whether Jesus was ever married, whether he ever had sex, whether he ever had a child. I have a friend who studied Lutheran theology extensively, and I was talking to her about this, and she couldn't even listen to this conversation. I hope you can at least listen to the conversation. The Bible is silent about those issues. Silent. And so are, to the best of my knowledge, all of the contemporary documents. None of them say, yes, he was married. But then none of them say, no, he wasn't married either. Gospels and other documents are silent, and Dan Brown's proof on the subject falls way short. You can read it yourself and explore that. Could it be true? Sure. Is it true? We'll never know. It does appear from the Gospels we have that Jesus respected women and treated them well in general. He broke some of the patterns of the patriarchal culture around him in how he talked with women. And clearly there were women, including Mary Magdalene, who were faithful followers, who traveled with him, and who supported his ministry. And Jesus, unlike Paul, didn't urge his followers not to marry. The church was many, many, many centuries before the church decided that priests couldn't be married, for example. Some of Jesus' 12 disciples were married, most notably Peter. But Jesus, we just simply don't know. But to me, the most interesting question is, would it matter to your faith if Jesus had been married, if he had had sex? You wouldn't to mine. Why? Because I really believe that Jesus was wholly human. And being sexual is part of being human, an important part. That's a fact, folks. Though unfortunately some churches have tried hard to identify sexuality with sinfulness. But think about it. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that we concur with those bishops, that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine. How would it impact his divinity if he embraced his humanity? Why is the idea of his sexuality so threatening? I invite you to think about that. It's your faith. Do your own wrestling with the questions. Own your own faith. And now comes a very important time in our service when we have an opportunity to give something of our substance for the sake of the work of the church. So I invite the ushers to come forward and all of us to give generously.